Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It's your local community radio station, and my name's Andy, and I'll be hanging out on your airwaves for the next hour. It's a nice rainy day for being indoors. I hope you've got a dry spot to listen, because I've got an interesting conversation coming up on the show with Jonathan Cornford. Jonathan is a sort of writer. I guess maybe he does have academic qualifications. He's got a couple of PhDs, I think, but he's a public intellectual, I think is how he's sort of trying to do it himself. And a lot of his thinking is about living simply and how we could have a more just world, a more economically equitable and more environmentally sustainable world if we change the way that we thought about wealth. And so I'm into this. I think this is some good thinking, and it certainly is countercultural in our society, where not only are we constantly the pressures of sort of advertising and things like that to be richer, better, have more stuff, but also the subtle cultural pressures in all kinds of ways is that we need to be richer and richer. And I'm not sure it's a good thing for us. I'm even less sure it's a good thing for our planet, everybody trying to be richer and have more stuff, and the disposability of so much of what we own, and then of so much of what we're working towards, right? That if we spend our lives invested in this system that's just making disposable crap, what does it mean for our lives? So I think there's all kinds of questions to ask about, our lives spent accumulating wealth. And of course, because of the system that we live in, when we accumulate wealth, we generally are accumulating wealth for other people who are richer than us as well, because when we go to work for their businesses or when we're putting money into their financial institutions, they're making money off us all the time. So the system, this capitalist system, wants to be richer all the time because that's its nature. That's what it does. It doesn't have a brain or a conscience or anything like that. It exists just to grow wealth, but that doesn't mean that it has the best interests of all of us at heart. Now, we have to take part in that, and it's a belief of some of us, myself included, that if the system can, it will kill us all and destroy all of us, and that we need to find ways to resist it before it gets to that. So anyway, that's some of what we'll be talking about with Jonathan. He wrote an article in The Guardian, actually. I have read his writing over the years quite a bit, but he wrote an article recently in a more mainstream publication, and I thought, this is really good, somebody saying this very countercultural message in a sort of mainstream space. And I posted it on social media, and it generated a lot of discussion, a lot of critique. And so I thought that was interesting. I thought, well, let's expand on it a bit. Let's get chatting it a bit and talk about some of the critiques that people raised as well. So you'll hear that in the course of the interview as well. And for now, well, let's get into it with Jonathan.
My name's Jonathan Cornford. I run a funny little organisation called Manigum. And Manigum basically operates in the Christian world. And I guess you call it primarily do popular education. And it's helping Christians reclaim what the Bible has to teach around economic life, which by today's standards is fairly radical stuff and fairly poorly known by most Australian Christians. So, yeah, that's very simply what my work is.
I think today we'll keep the conversation mostly at a secular level because that's where probably a lot of our listeners will be at. But I think there's still a lot of crossover, and you did in fact write an article recently for The Guardian which stimulated some discussion about living simply, and I'm interested in talking about that today. So maybe we'll start off with a bit of a definition of what living simply means.
Well, you start with a hard question. I'm a bit ambivalent about that term, living simply, Andy. Look, I do use the term because it's one of those sort of shorthand terms that, people sort of know what you mean, but it does require a fair bit of qualification, because I think for many people in our culture in this day and age, it's living simply is actually pretty complicated. So it's I certainly don't mean some sort of idyllic picture of really having very few issues to deal with, living unencumbered, perhaps off the land, self-sufficiently or something like that. When I talk about living simply, and more often I talk about trying to live on a lower income, I'm really talking about trying to live a lower consumption lifestyle. So we live in what's basically a consumer economy, and consumerism, as we all know, is one of the primary forces that makes and drives us as individuals, and it's around trying to step back from that. And so consumption and income are very closely linked. So living on a lower income, living a lower consumption lifestyle, and then the third part of that is really trying to live as beneficially as you can in relation to all the connections that we have in the world, in relation to our neighbours, to our family, and in relation to the earth, to do the best job we can do in making good choices for everyone and not just for us.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm an advocate of buying less stuff, and because of the way that money is intertwined with many things in our economy, like in trying to have less money, but it can mean a lot of things, and that's right. And a lot of people's first assumptions when they hear often are not what you mean either. And so I guess let's extend a bit about it. We'll talk about the reasons a bit more in a second, but I guess what are some models of what this can look like?
Models. So mostly, I think it's important, Andy, just to be a bit contextual on how we frame this. So mostly when I'm talking about living simply, or more often talking about living on a lower income, I'm addressing people who are usually pretty much middle-class Australians or above, often tertiary educated, who have a certain range of choices about the sorts of both incomes and lifestyles they can pursue. That's my context. That's really the context I'm addressing. And so I'm addressing people who have some range of choice. And the models for living more simply or on a lower income, lower consumption lifestyle is basically around doing various things to live off a lower income, and the easiest one of those is to choose to work part-time instead of full-time if you're able to. Not everyone is, but if that's a choice you're able to, then that's an option that will reduce your income, therefore reduce your consumption, but also give you the windfall of a bunch of extra time to do other things, which can be very usefully used in all sorts of directions. So that's model number one. Model number two would be to choose your work by conviction, contribution, and passion. So rather than pursue the highest income you can, if your chosen vocation, for example, is nursing, and what you really love about your vocation is being on the ward helping people, then continuing to do that, even if you could pursue promotions into management, which isn't necessarily where you're going to be best placed. And I know a number of people who have made those choices in their life, not to seek further promotion because they're doing what they feel they do best and where they can make their best contribution. And a third model is simply for some people, if you're a doctor, then you're going to earn a high income, but that's still a choice you could make by passion and conviction and contribution, but you don't have to live off all of that income. So you can set yourself an income cap there, and you come up with a figure, say this is enough for me, and then anything I earn above that I'm going to give away or do something else with. So there are a few ways of thinking about ways you could live off a lower income if that's in your range of choices.
And none of those things then disrupt people's lifestyles in general all that much. But I am interested, I guess, because you've pointed out that even people on a low income in Australia are, in comparison to the rest of the world, a relatively high income, really, and a level of standard of living. And so, I mean, you're talking there about people who are doctors and nurses, professionals and things like that. Do you think that your message is only for people who are in the higher echelon of wage earners in Australia, or do you think that there are certain parts that can apply to people that are on a lower income by Australian levels?
That's a more complicated question. So I'm aware, we're in the middle of a housing crisis, and there are people living basically off gig work or pretty low paid work, and they have very little choice in the sort of work they can get, whether they might be new migrants, for example, who find it hard to get other work. Even some with higher qualifications struggle to move beyond this cleaning and pet service station jobs, things like that. So if you're in that position, you're going to find it very hard to pay housing costs. A lot of the people's time, energy is just spent making things work and budgets balanced. So I want to keep that in mind, that's the reality for quite a number and a growing number of Australians. That said, just to make the whole thing a bit more complicated, overall, if you look at the whole national picture, Australia is an incredibly wealthy country. So we're in the top 10 highest income earners in the world. Even if you're on a Centrelink income in Australia, you're compared to someone living in sub-Saharan Africa, you are living astronomically better than other people in the world. And what you can consume in terms of food and material and energy and water is vastly greater than many other people in the world. So as an affluent nation, and we're all bred into the expectation and the desire for affluence. So if you're living on the bottom of, the Australian socio-economic pyramid, it could be comforting to say, well, I'm much better off than someone in sub-Saharan Africa. However, all of us are taught to look up, and what we're comparing ourselves to is not someone in sub-Saharan Africa, but the people at the top or higher end of the spectrum. So therein lies our problem. We're in an incredibly affluent country where everyone has either the expectation or the desire to live affluently. When I say everyone, most people. And that brings with it incredibly high consumption, high emission lifestyle that basically our planet can't afford. That's pretty clear. And actually is increasingly clear it's bad for us too, in both personal ways, but at the social, communal level, and even there are a lot of cases to argue that it's bad economically, particularly what we've done with housing. So what I'm saying is what we have a real need to do is to find a way to have a national conversation about becoming clear just how wealthy we are, and that actually we could be a little bit less wealthy at a per capita level as a nation and still do very well off and be a lot more socially and ecologically responsible.
It's a difficult conversation, difficult concept for a lot of people, and as you say, we're enculturated in a certain way of thinking about wealth and thinking about what we need to survive as well. But I guess one of the things, it remains a fringe conversation while it's talking about people's sort of personal preferences or something. But I guess one of the things that you've touched on there is that environmentally, and often economically, when we're talking about global sort of division of resources, there are very strong moral reasons why, people in wealthy countries like Australia should consider this. And does that change it when we talk about this as some kind of moral imperative? Does it then change the conversation?
Look, it should. It's not at the moment. I have to say it's not changing it yet. So, it's pretty clear. It's not just a moral imperative. And, what people think and mean by that term moral imperative is varies a bit. But look, even one thing everyone understands at one level is just clear self-interest, even at a basic sense of what I would call rational self-interest. If you have an interest in what life is going to be like for your children and grandchildren, then we need to make some significant changes to how the national economies of countries like Australia operate, because the world cannot handle it, and it will be bad in the long term for everyone, including us.
Yeah. It's funny in the conversation about climate justice and climate goals and things like that. People talk about emissions reduction and they have these like Paris targets and things like that. But it is very rare that anybody talks about people who live rich lifestyles having less, or us having less stuff, or us making less. It's mostly these kind of tweaks. Do you think that is realistic, or do you think that we just are unable to talk about what real climate justice might look like?
Yeah, look, and it's not, so climate justice is obviously huge and central, but it's not just climate justice. So we're in the midst of essentially a multi-dimensional global ecological crisis, and climate change is just one of those components. So we massively need to reduce our energy, our carbon emissions, but actually for all sorts of other ecological reasons to do with pollution, the destruction of habitat and so on, we need to reduce our whole material throughput of our economy and of our households. So at the household level, we need to reduce our material throughput. That's just the amount of stuff that comes through our homes and ends up in landfill. And we need to reduce the amount of energy and water that each household consumes. It means we need to do it at a national level. And that's for a whole raft of reasons, not just climate change. So the imperative is pretty clear in a scientific sense. And I think you can make it pretty strongly in a social sense as well. You're entering a different territory, but charting what's happened to the affluent economies in the last 50 years or so in terms of mental health and social well-being, breakdown of community and relationship, all those sorts of things. There's a very strong case to be made that a more equitable and generally less high consumption form of lifestyle, but actually I would say better quality of life is what we need. Can we actually make that case politically? Well, no one is doing it at the moment.
Let's talk now a bit about trying to make the case, and in one way talk about what you're just talking about there, that there are benefits to living with less. And this is certainly a part of the conversation that is important, because if you're just saying, well, everybody should be poorer, nobody's going to do it. But this is where we can start to frame it in interesting ways and say, well, imagine what life would be like if, such and such. Do you want to talk a bit about that, potential benefits that would come from living on a lower income or less consumptive lifestyle?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? Just the words we use. As soon as you say we all need to be a bit poorer, that just immediately frames it in a negative light, which everyone goes, well, that's bad. But actually, I mean, the first step is just to get real about how fantastically wealthy we are and how much we consume, and to get a bit real to say, actually, if we pay attention to, depending how old you are, our own lives or the lives of our parents or grandparents, we could actually live with a fair bit less stuff and even lower incomes and live pretty fulfilling lives. In fact, no less fulfilling. In lots of ways, we can imagine some things, if we reclaim a bit more time or a bit less complexity in our lives, a bit more connection, life being better. And there's all sorts of ways we can make that case. And I think a lot of people can, if you get down to that, we're all different in different circumstances and contexts, but most people can relate that in some way or another.
Yeah, I think I'm a very, very strong advocate for working less, like you saying individuals should try to reduce their working hours, but also I think across the board a 4-day work week would be so good. And part of it is that just we all understand in some way that the things we do outside of work are of value, and that more time for families to spend together, more time for people to spend on just their passions and interests, that it would benefit individuals, and also that there's potentially this whole wealth of untapped potential of what people would do if they had the time to do things that they care about just for that reason, without any kind of economic reasons behind it.
Oh, absolutely. There's also, I think there's a very strong case to make for things like the 4-day working week and much higher and more progressive taxation levels in Australia, whole bunch of things that affect the pre-distribution of Australian wealth, and which would allow governments to return to a state where we can say, actually, if we have generally lower per capita incomes than we do now, but all education is genuinely free, and good healthcare is genuinely free. These are not things you need to worry about in your life. And people have time for the development of rich community life and the sorts of organisations at local and community levels, involvements that provide connection and actually a lot of the help that people get in their day-to-day lives, those sorts of things, then yeah, I think it's a realistic proposition that we're putting. Selling it politically right now is a challenge.
Yeah, I think lots of people are affronted by the idea, I guess. And let's talk about some of the critiques, because I did share your article on a social media site, and my networks on that site are predominantly people who would in some way say they align with kind of progressive politics. But there was quite a lot of appreciation, but also quite a lot of critiques of your article, and so I'm interested in working through some of them. And I guess one of the critiques was that this kind of idea is purely affects you on an individual level and does nothing to kind of change societal structures.
Sure. I mean, if you're just choosing to make those choices as a self-contained moral choice so that you're living a quote-unquote ethical or moral lifestyle, then yeah, I agree. That's not what I'm proposing, though.
Yeah, well, it's one of the things, I mean, any individual change can come with other ways of working on more collective solutions, and it's an interesting thing that if you had more time freed up, then it starts to open up other possibilities of what kind of work you can do, political work or organising or things like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so I guess there's a couple of dimensions to the sorts of things I'm talking about, and the problem with the sort of article I wrote is because it's a newspaper article, the length you're given, you can't really go into it all. But so at the first level, there's just a personal dimension. For those people who are, potentially, middle class professional people looking who the draw is into a high income, high consumption lifestyle, this sort of choice makes sense for personal reasons. It's a good way to live, as against the option that is generally chosen. So that's just at a very personal level. But more broadly speaking, the political relevance of it is essentially to make 2 points. Is to firstly say it's what some post-capitalist thinkers call a prefigurative choice. It's saying these are the sorts of low income lifestyles or low consumption lifestyles is where we need to go as a society. And look, you can do it. And actually, it's pretty good. It's not as if choosing to live dirt poor lives of hardship. That's not what we're saying. Actually, what we're saying is you can live at a lower consumption lifestyle and for it to be fulfilling. Here's the evidence we're doing it. And the evidence on downshifters is quite strong, actually, in terms of sense of well-being. So that's one part of the message. The end game is to say this is where we need to go as an economy, rather than, it's simply, it's a good choice to make for both personal reasons, but also, in sense of statements of principle about where we need to go, but to try and advocate for all Australians to make this choice personally, and that's how we're going to address climate change or the ecological crisis, is pretty, I think, misguided. What we actually need to do is make some pretty big political decisions about how we restructure the economy, and that's ultimately where we need to be placing our political energies.
All right, well, another critique that came up is that living like this requires a certain amount of individual privilege, and one of the examples that people cited is intergenerational wealth. But there's other levels of privilege to do with, your race and background and health and whatever.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. That's why I said I'm talking contextually to people, essentially to people of privilege. There's a lot of people who... As I was trying to say earlier, a lot of the people, this is not even a choice. They don't have the time or the energy to think about these sorts of things. They don't have the time or the energy to think about lowering their emissions. They're just trying to find a house to rent, which is pretty bloody hard in Australia today, and try to find, keep their gig work enough to be able to cover that astronomical rent. So I totally agree. That's why we need a political change at the level of economic structure that changes those dynamics. It's a choice for people of privilege, but it's not a privileged choice. It's people who say, it's a privilege to be able to choose this, as if the privilege is, well, I get to say I'm moral, when that's a pretty pointless statement. It's a good choice to make, but more importantly, it's a choice for a responsible choice to make. It's if you have certain options in front of you, but to choose something different, to choose for a more responsible way to live, is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking to people who don't have that choice.
One of the things that did come up is intergenerational wealth, because you mentioned in your article that as a qualifier in some ways to say that you're not some kind of superhero, you mentioned in there that, your parents did help you out. And a lot of people then sort of took up on that to say, well, see, this person's cheated their way into wealth or something like that. But, Thomas Piketty, the economist, a few years ago wrote about income inequality around the world, and said that one of the biggest issues is intergenerational wealth. And what he proposed was a very significant inheritance tax, right? Yeah. And it's like, I see this politically as something you could never sell. For a lot of people, their main driving force in life is to leave money for their children. It's like, what can you do to address intergenerational wealth, and is it something that we would want to?
Oh, it absolutely is, because Piketty's right, and he was by no means the first person to make the point. People have been making that point for over 100 years now, that one of the key mechanisms for social inequity is the wealth transfer between generations. So inheritance tax is really necessary, and we have actually had versions of it in the past. We have done it before, and we can do it again. It's not as politically impossible as it can seem. It's actually a reasonably easy tax to implement. There's all sorts of things going for an inheritance tax.
There's all sorts of things going for it, including the fact of, like, you're being taxed on money you did nothing to earn, right? But there is people would be so affronted, the idea that your children should not be given the money that you've worked so hard to earn, I guess, is the other side of it.
Look, if you think of people on a lower middle income level, and you know that being taxed to the buoy so that their kids get hardly anything, that's not what we're talking about with inheritance taxes. So most proposals for inheritance taxes are pretty steeply progressive taxes, which means they kick in at a higher level and they go up as the level of transfer goes up. So you could imagine inheritance tax in Australia. You would select a level of windfall. So your inheritance windfall is that you begin to tax at, whether it's, I don't know, you pick a number, Andy, but that would be where you have your national conversation to see what's fair. Where do you begin to tax that windfall, and then how steeply does the curve go up as that windfall goes up?
I think it is an interesting thing when we say that we in Australia are proportionally amongst the richest people in the world, which you have said. But when it comes to those of us, when we do have, an economic crisis like we do now, and the cost of living issues, that we're not very good at being poor, at living with less. At the rest of in other parts of the world, people manage to survive on much less than we have now, because I guess they don't have that expectation about being poor, and there are ways of living collectively or things like that are skills that we just don't have in Australia. Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. So there is a huge amount to be said for collective expectation or collective imagination, and that's, we use a word like a amorphous word like a national culture. It's very hard to pin down, but there is such a thing. There's the word Max Weber used was a spirit. He talked about the spirit of capitalism, and we have a capitalist consumer spirit in our country that shapes how we think about life and what we expect from it, what we want from it, and then if that doesn't happen, how we feel about life. So I think, I'm no expert on this, but I'm pretty sure that one big part of the mental health crisis that is so broadly stretching across our culture is that life is not panning out how people have been told to expect it should. There's really clear and pretty robust data internationally to say some pretty basic things, and the human story goes something like this in the modern world. People who experience a rise in income experience a rise in happiness for a short period of time, and then it just normalizes. It becomes a new normal. The new material throughput and standard of living becomes what they now expect. And that's the same for pretty much everyone in the income spectrum except for one group, and that's the group right at the bottom. When they experience a rise in income, they experience a rise in well-being, and it's sustained. Flip that, and when people experience a loss in income, people experience, as you'd expect, a loss in well-being, except that is not temporary, that's long-lived. When people experience a loss in income and they haven't chosen it, then their life is harder, or they report life being worse. And there's one clear exception, and that is people who have chosen a lower income for whatever reason that they've chosen it, values-based reasons for lower income. They experience increase in well-being, and it's sustained. So, there's a bunch of data around downshifting and all that sort of stuff, income and happiness. But I think most people could actually see that are in there. You could see examples around you and see the truth of those things. What we're talking about is the need to make those choices collectively. So when we collectively experience a reduction in income like we have now we're in high inflation, unemployment's starting to go up again because that's what the Reserve Bank wants it to do. They're forcing that. And at the same time, housing is just ridiculous, the cost of housing. And of course, people are unhappy. But what we're saying is, arguing for, is collectively to reduce our level of income and consumption, but to increase our well-being through a bunch of shifting the furniture around economically, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that brings us to an interesting point, though, that we need a collective decision-making, and normally the way that works is on the level of kind of politics, voting, and that's how we make these decisions collectively. But as you've just said there, that on some level this is about a consciousness change. It's not just a purely political thing, and that's reflected in the way that you're going about it, right? You're not running a political party. You're instead working on some kind of change on the spiritual or consciousness level. I guess, do you think that that is necessary? It's the only way to get to this point, or do you think that it could be just a political thing? And I guess, what are the virtues of both?
Well, it ultimately has to get to a political thing, but we're not going to get there without a pretty serious consciousness change. And that's why I think the sorts of, if you find yourself a privileged person with privileged options in front of you, why it's a responsible thing to do, is because what we need to do bit by bit, whether through our own lives and then talking about it publicly, writing about it, is to be doing what we can to change how people see life. And people, I think seeing other people make different choices and how that pans out for them, I think is powerful. So people can see the message about living on lower income, higher well-being form of life when they know someone who's doing it, rather than if you're just using words in, coming through the media on TV. So we definitely we need a consciousness change, because at the moment there's no major political party in Australia that's going to run with anything like this. Not until that message is increasingly being put forth through broader culture, and it has to get into our popular culture through music and film and art and all that sort of stuff. It has to get into our media through various forms, has to get into the conversations that people have and what they're learning at school and university. So we have to be part of somehow trying to change consciousness to get to political change, because we need political change. It's not one or the other, we need both.
All right, thanks very much for having a chat with us today, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
You are listening to 4ZZZ. The Paradigm Shift is the show. We had Jonathan Cornford chatting about living on a low-consumption lifestyle, low-income lifestyle, which he does recommend, and I think it's a good idea too. As I said earlier, when I shared an article written by Jonathan, there were a lot of people wanting to argue, and obviously a lot of people already are doing it tough and struggling, but I think that's where we've got to say, the system, the wealth-generating system, it's not our friend, It doesn't give us wealth the more that we work for it, the more that we try to buy stuff, invest money. It takes more from us, It takes our time, but also it takes our money. Every time you work, if you're working for a company that runs at a profit, every hour of labour that you do, they take more money off it than they give you. And that's the reality of it. And let's try to find ways around it and find ways of reclaiming our lives to be not just that which makes money, reclaim our time and our identity as well. And we might even be able to reclaim our planet from those who are happy to destroy it for their own profits. And so I think that all these things are very much worth thinking about. And yeah, I hope it's been some good food for thought hearing from Jonathan today, chatting about different ways. And I think it's sort of in small ways. I think that working less is just so imperative for our society, for economically as well. Like, I think we just are generating too much stuff and too much money. But I think more importantly, it's to reclaim our lives for our own mental health and to have space to build the kind of society that we want to live in, not the kind of society that the dollar wants us to make, so it can grow. And I think if you look at what can be done if people had the time to do things out of passion and out of love and their interests. Well, 4ZZZ is a good example. It runs almost entirely on volunteer labour. And because of that, doesn't have the kind of commercial imperatives that mean we have to be playing whatever boring music or advertising all the time, programming things to suit our advertisers. We all get a better product out of it, and it is possible to make things that are good and beautiful and life-affirming, and that it's certainly are better than what our capitalist system can offer us. So, that, like I said before, there's just so much potential that could be unlocked if we could get people off the treadmill of the capitalist work to be talking about what's really important and what do we want to do. And as well, political organising, one of the biggest hindrances for any kind of political organising is people just don't have time. And we need some way of reclaiming that. But living, of course, working less generally means having less money, and a lot of us are struggling, and so then we need ways, creative ways of living with less money. And part of that's just it is a change in how you identify. If you are going to identify with things that are expensive to buy, clothes, cars, whatever, then you need an identity change. But there's so much waste in our society, so many things secondhand, so much disposability of things that could be fixed, and it's very possible to live quite comfortably off a lot of what is wasted in our society. I can tell you from experience. And also, there's ways of living communally where we can share resources, both by living together in the same house, the same space, but also by trying to set up networks of shared resources and things like that. All these things are possible. And again, we need the time to do it, but also we need to really try to have to fight the system that is telling us to buy more, work more, own more, invest more, and it's hard to resist that. And so, yeah, that's but we might need to do it for our own sanity and for the sake of our planet. Anyway, we're about out of time on the paradigm shift. I'll be back next week, of course, and I'll have more conversations with people thinking outside of the box with you. See you next week.